we've already been doing thus far and melding it together. That is taking urban geography and mixing it with political ecology. So this week's lecture is titled Merging Political Ecology and Urban Geography, Understanding Slums. So the objective of this session is basically to begin to incorporate what we've learned about political ecology with what we know about urban geography. In other words, we're going to start asking questions that are relevant to political ecology, but we'll be asking them in an urban context. Now, the two lecture objectives that we have for today are, first, using the examples of slums, we're going to begin to incorporate questions of urban geography with questions of political ecology. And second of all, I want you by the end of this lecture to really be able to view slums as, first of all, a manifestation of inequitable political and economic structures. And secondly, I really want you to begin to see these as a phenomenon that typify the environmental problems that can result from inequitable power structures. Now, before I move on with this week's lecture, I want to situate it first a bit within the context of what we've already been discussing. So thus far, we have discussed urban geography and political ecology in more of a historical lens, so that we can understand the central theories, the central philosophers in each of those realms. But now we're going to begin to understand urban political ecology as the nexus between urban geography and political ecology. So just a quick review. With regards to political ecology in general, when we read the Blakey and Brookfield piece, we were talking about three main critiques of that piece. Does anyone recall what those three critiques are? Yeah.
It is poverty-centric. It is only about rural areas. And it only talks about land.
Right. So these are the three critiques that we have. Perfect. Now, what about the critiques of urban geography? There was one main critique that we discussed there. Does anybody remember what that was?
It does not talk about the environment.
Exactly. So that is our next critique. Now, what urban political ecology does is it starts to mesh those things together, and we start asking new questions. So for example, we read the Peat and Watts piece for this week, where they asked, how, for example, might poverty or political ecology help explain worker injuries in plants in northern Mexico, or in toxic dumping in Nigeria, or urban water pollution in Turin? So it's this type of question that we really want to start asking. So for example, instead of just noting that there have been more slums growing or noting that urbanization has increased, we want to explore how these two processes have worked together and why they have worked together. So we might want to ask a question like this, like what is the relationship between the explosion of urban growth and the fact that it is informal slum growth, and why do these processes go together? So first of all, why are we looking at slums? First of all, like we've discussed, urbanization is becoming the norm. The world is rapidly urbanizing, and it's not the urbanization proper that we're accustomed to. So what we see is that this urbanization is really largely driven by poverty rather than by the supply of jobs, which is what urbanization has typically been driven by. So just a few statistics here, and I want to reiterate that I don't want you to be trying to memorize facts and figures from this lecture. I just really want you to start understanding how we're going to conceive of urban political ecology and what types of questions we can ask and what types of issues we're looking at. So first of all, in Mexico City, 60% of all growth is informal. That's huge, that's a majority. Now, if we're going to contrast that with the statistic from the developing world, if we look at the ratio of slum to cities in the developed world, that's only 6%. That's a very, very low number, especially when you compare it to lower developed countries. So for example, in lesser developed countries, 78% of the urban population are slum dwellers. Now, I highlight Ethiopia here because it really is such an excellent example. 94% of the city dwellers in Ethiopia either live in informal housing or work in formal jobs. Informal urbanization really represents the majority of urbanism. Now, what we would need to look at now is what makes the slum unique. And so I'm going to present to you a couple different types of slums and just note some general elements of a slum. So first of all, with slum growth, we're dealing with the need for new concepts, and the concept peri-urban has arisen. And peri-urban serves to highlight those areas that are really high in development, high density of population, but the problem is that they are also very highly unurban in their infrastructure. So as you can see here, this is very high density, very high population, but if you look at the building materials, this is not what we're accustomed to. This is not what we really typify as urban. And I do want to point out that we're seeing a different sort of rural-city reality here, a different sort of relationship between country and city life. The countryside is becoming increasingly industrialized, whereas the city is becoming higher density, less formal, and what we're seeing is a shift in the production relations, and that really changes the way that society and individuals can and do interact with their environment, which is a central question in political ecology. So next we have Mexico City. Here's an example that really typifies how a slum can actually exist immediately adjacent to or even within a formal city. Yet the slum and the slum dwellers could be extremely disconnected from the formal population, and by that I mean very disconnected from the social and economic realities and processes of formal life. So here's an example of tenements in the United States. I just wanted you to see an example of slums from the developed world. I know a lot of you are accustomed to seeing buildings like this, and they've been renovated now, but they used to really be havens for lots of health problems due to overcrowding and overpopulation. Now, I want to throw the ball to you for a moment, and I want you to look at these pictures. I hope you can see them well. These are pictures from slums all over the world, and what I want you to do is look at these photos and tell me what sort of issues related to urban political ecology can you see in them? What sorts of questions would you ask in terms of urban political ecology? So any comments on these?
It seems like they have a waste problem
Mm-hmm. Great.
and maybe water contamination.
Right, perfect. So yeah, this really does show us that there are a lot of environmental issues. You see over here, this is actually essentially a garbage dump, and this is not uncommon for slums to be located alongside a garbage dump. In fact, a lot of slum dwellers can extract economic means from a garbage dump. You also see issues where you see a lot of pollution in the water, and this is only the visible contamination that you see. And it's a very serious problem because that does affect the health of the slum dwellers as well as all surrounding areas that use this contaminated water. And then you can also see over here that we're using really informal materials once again, essentially scraps that have just been gathered from here and there and put together, which really makes precarious housing. So given all of this, we can see that slums are clearly an issue of urban political ecology, and we can see how dangerous they can be. So why would one live in a slum? And this is a question that we really need to understand because some do actually choose to live in a slum. The thing about slums is that they really do optimize a bunch of elements, some of which I have listed here. For example, they optimize housing costs. Oftentimes, it's much less expensive to live in a slum than it is to live in formal housing, and this is a really big consideration, particularly when you have a fixed income. You can't spend all of your income on housing alone. You also need extra income to pay for food and other necessities. Tenure security is another issue. In many cities, I know if anybody lives in Manhattan, which I know some of you are from Manhattan, rents are constantly going up So tenure security, will you be able to pay for your apartment or house down the road? In terms of quality of shelter, this is something that you may give up. You may choose to not have a bathroom in your home if that means having a shorter journey to work. Essentially, you could maybe also choose to sacrifice personal safety. But I should note that some do argue that slums in certain cases can be a bit more safe because there's a bit of community mentality, but obviously there are those times where slums are a bit more dangerous to live in. So basically what I want you to see from this is that there are a lot of pressures that do drive individuals to choose informal shelter over other forms of shelter. Now, what we need to question is, how did this happen? How did we get to this sort of slum growth? And the really important question to ask before we answer that is, how didn't slums exist 50 years ago? What prevented the existence of slums? And so this goes all the way back to colonial history. Now, when the British were in India, they really regulated growth, and they actually controlled migration. So they prevented people from migrating from rural areas into the city. Now, this is primarily because they acknowledged the wealth that can be extracted from the countryside. So after emancipation, a lot of new states realized this. They continued to realize the wealth that could be extracted from the rural areas. They wanted people to stay there. They also wanted to maintain borders, and they wanted a diverse economy, and that required keeping people in the rural areas. So as a result, a lot of people argue that slum development began as a result of decolonialization. Now, after colonialism, this is a different story. This is when in the 1970s we have a lot of international institutions like the World Bank, most notoriously the IMF, really intervening here, setting rules for debtor countries that really required them to take on neoliberal policies, which included shrinking government programs and privatizing housing markets. And this really made prices skyrocket in some areas. It made housing extremely inaccessible for many areas of the population. So for a lot of people, this is now argued as the principal impetus of slum development. And as we discussed with political ecology, these are precisely the questions that we want to address, is how the interactions of political and economic institutions actually affect the way that humans can interact with their environment. So in this case, actually government intervention in the case of colonialism, and then again in neoliberalism, prevented people from interacting with their with the urban environment, and forced them to interact with the rural environment in certain ways. And so this really is a question that needs to be mined in. Now I just want to leave you with a few takeaway points. First of all, slums, and here I have both emerged and emerged because this process is still going on, but slums emerge from inequitable economic and political structures. This is just what we have discussed and what you can see in more detail in the readings for this week. Second of all, such structures, these inequitable political and economic structures, they really do push individuals and communities to engage with their environments in a very different manner. And finally, we see how ecological hazards can actually be socially constructed. So for example, with those images that we saw where the water is contaminated, or where you see a huge mound of waste, these are socially constructed circumstances. So a lot of people tend to see environmental hazards as something that's almost natural, and we see here that that is just simply not the case. Alright, now I just want to check to see if anybody has any questions. No? Okay, well, I do want to make one final point, and that is that it's really important that you learn to assess a scenario like this through a similar lens, because for your final project, you're going to have to identify a real-world scenario, and you're going to have to assess it and really outline how that particular scenario came to exist and what the realities of that scenario are. So you may very well choose to focus on a particular slum, whether that be in the United States, so we're going to move on to group work, and let's start.